Hello, my name is Zach Flood, and this is Randy Flood, and we work at the Men's Resource Center and the Fountain Hill Center of West Michigan. We wanted to come here and talk about some of the dilemmas that professionals in our field might run into. We want to take the opportunity to speak about how clinicians working within alienation dynamics can be put into situations that are challenging. We think this is helpful for targeted parents and other professionals to hear because building empathy for and understanding another person's experience within a system can help everyone navigate the system better. This is even more important when a system is normally stressful and conflictual. It should be said, Randy and I have both done multiple presentations on this channel. Randy, among other topics, has spoken about the dilemmas that parents experience in alienation dynamics. I've spoken about unwitting accomplices and some other topics as well, and how they impact alienated children and targeted parents. We have worked in this field and acknowledge that targeted parents and the alienated children's experiences are the most important and painful aspects of the system. We feel that it is important to have a discussion on this topic so that the targeted parents can have a deep and understanding of as deep an understanding as possible of the system as a whole, because that can be really helpful. We feel that a lot of instances where a clinician that is either evaluating or treating a family where alienation is present is faced with dilemmas where two competing truths are at play. And these situations are difficult to manage and can leave some clinicians or evaluators exhausted or delusioned. We want to go over a few of the main dilemmas that these professionals can be presented with to provide some good context to the environment to which these services are being provided. I'll be presenting some questions to Randy that he can posit about, and I can weave in some insights as well. One overarching theme that can be applicable throughout this discussion is that alienating parents deploy the same tactics towards clinicians in the systems they work in that they do towards targeted parents. Of course, the effects of these actions are different, and by no means is the experience of clinicians need to be equated to the experience of targeted parents, but the similarities of the strategies are notable. Another overarching theme is the guidelines that clinicians are required to follow in order to do this work. Right, Randy, can you tell us a little bit about the history of these guidelines and how you've had to work within them throughout your career?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm the old guy in the dyad here. So yeah, I began working in the field of forensic psychology and family forensic psychology in particular in 1992. Um, and so doing forensic counseling and evaluations prior to guidelines being in place was kind of like the wild, wild west, before the lawyers came in and created the order and the rules and such. There was like just a everybody was kind of doing what they thought was helpful. We had a lot of good intentioned professionals who would be tapped by family court judges or legal professionals to say, hey, we got these families in conflict and we need your help. Can you provide an evaluation or you provide some counseling? And there just wasn't really any specific guidelines. And so, in that area with a good intention to help, some zealous mental health professionals, made some mistakes, and and so along the way of making mistakes, we end up eventually having guidelines. And so in 2006 was the first guidelines that came along, and I remember being a member of the Association of Family Conciliation Courts when they announced those. And again, just when they launched doesn't mean that professionals started using them or lawyers became aware of them, where they began holding professionals accountable on the stand for the kind of evaluations they were doing or the type of counseling they were doing and staying in their lane. But they eventually got traction in the late 2000s, and then eventually they revised them in 2022. Just recently is a whole revision of the AFCC guidelines for custody evaluations and some other forensic counseling guidelines. And so there has been, as you said, Zach, a history, and as Zach said in the introduction, there's always two profound truths in a dilemma, and that is that when well-intentioned mental health professionals were involved, a lot of them did a lot of great work. And I remember writing reports. My reports were like 10 pages at the most, and evaluating a family and coming up with recommendations for the courts, just to show you how things have evolved. Now the reports that Zach and I are involved in for evaluations can range from 100 to 350 pages depending on on the case. And so because there's so many requirements, and we'll get into that later, but the guidelines are there to help hold professionals accountable, but they also provide some constrictions and some increased costs that we'll speak to later in
Mhm.
our conversation.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about some of those unintended consequences setting up these guidelines and tip our hat to the fact that they're good. Having guidelines is good because it gets everyone on the same page, make sure that people are going about things the right way. But again, we're going to probably say this two profound truths things a few times during this presentation, but there are going to be some consequences on the other side of that coin. So what would you say like the biggest unintended consequences unintended consequence that you would find? We'll go through a few, but what's the biggest one that would come to mind for you, Randy?
Yeah, I think that again, as you can tell with like a 10-page report, um, doesn't take much time to write, right? Just imagine how much time it takes to write a 350-page report. So again, we bill out by the hour. So just in the report writing time, the increased costs. And so also there's requirements about us having to do certain kind of assessment interviews and making sure that we are comprehensive in our interviews. And so early on in my career, we might not have had to interview a step parent because they weren't considered the biological parents. Where now, if they're a caregiver in the children's life, we're sometimes interviewing four parents. And then sometimes there can be a live-in grandparent that is a significant caregiver. So again, the scope of the evaluation in terms of what is required of evaluators to include, because if we take shortcuts and we don't include that to save costs, then we can get criticized for not including significant caregivers in an evaluation. And so the other thing is just collateral sources. Again, as time has marched on and the internet has come on board, there's a lot of electronic footprint that parents bring in to the evaluation. And so that is expansive. And they again want us to look at those that data. And so again, we can't overlook that. So people will bring us massive amounts of data that we
Mhm.
have to look into. And then interviewing teachers and such. We just need to be really thorough and comprehensive, and that is, Zach, has increased the costs. And
Mhm.
so we'll say more about this, but
Mhm.
we've gone from some families now in private evaluations just are can't afford the kind of evaluations that we are required to perform because of
Mhm.
the guidelines. And so, and if we take shortcuts, then we compromise the process.
Yeah, I think what specifically in the guidelines, I don't know how specific you want to get here, but what would be the one main thing that's led to this expanding in scope? Can you be specific about generally what was in the guidelines that would lead to that?
Well, just that the guidelines have a requirement for us. You speaking mostly about evaluations, Zach?
Yeah, right for now. Yeah, yep. That's
Yeah,
right.
just as I was speaking to earlier, the guidelines require us to have multiple streams of data
Mm,
to pursue gathering data on the family. And so you have the cost of psychological testing, and then you
mm,
have the cost of multiple interviews, and then with the family members, and then you have the cost of reviewing the collateral data that is submitted
mhm,
via electronically, and then also doing collateral interviews with professionals and family members that are involved in the case. And then if you get into a specific situation where there's um, a need for a consultant because you have someone who's
mhm,
hearing impaired, and that child has certain challenges, and so you might want to consult with a hearing impaired specialist to kind of get their sense of how a child is going to consume information and such.
mhm,
So there's that requirement to go outside just the
mhm,
cost of me as an evaluator, but to bring in other consultants into the case. And then lastly, I think product reviewers has been an
mhm,
additional the last 10 years. Um, so we do an evaluation, and then if the parents don't like the results of the evaluation, then they can submit the evaluation to a product reviewer, and then they can critique the evaluation, and then you end up, parents are paying for the product reviewer, and then we go to court to testify with competing opinions about what is happening in the family. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes there's a product reviewer who reviews the product reviewer, who then reviews my evaluation. So these multiple professionals are getting
Mm-hmm.
involved, and it's very contentious, like who
Mm-hmm.
has the right protocol, who has the right opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece I'll
Well,
say, Zach, just real quickly, is just the
mm-hmm.
requirement for resources. It used to be that most of our the 10-page report, 15-page report was us opining as clinicians about what we're seeing in the room, and then providing our best clinical intuition as to what we think is best for the family in terms of making recommendations about custody and parenting time. Now we have to then base all of our opinions on the research in professional journals. So a report now can have a bibliography of 25 different resources that we're citing and
Mm-hmm.
then incorporating. And again, it's
Some more. Yeah.
important to
Yeah.
have your opinions backed up by science,
Yep.
but it takes more time.
Yeah. So I think it's important for us to talk about why does this play into how does this play into the experience of a targeted parent, and why has this become a dilemma? So we're giving you a little bit of a background here of like, all right, so here's what it was in the past where it could be more limited in scope, and there would be some opining of a clinical impression, some interviewing, getting a sense of the family, doing a little bit of testing here and there, and really being able to have a good idea of what was going on. Like you said, there's a lot of good work, but when there are guidelines to follow, then a lawyer who is trying to be a zealous advocate for their client can say, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do this?
Right,
And they can actually point to something on a page. And so, therefore, on the front end, as clinicians, we are presented with a dilemma. It's like, do we do all of this and proactively shield ourselves in the litigation process to do a really thorough job, or do we try to make our product more accessible to clients so that they can get help for their families? And so there are two profound truths. We want to make our product accessible, but we want to be thorough. And so like what we're stuck in the middle of that. So again, this isn't a boo-hoo, poor us type of situation, but it's really important for targeted parents to understand that when they're trying to figure out the scope of what they're asking for and what they're trying
right,
to do, and so that they can know that there's a balancing act that the people
right,
that they go to have to
right,
figure out.
right. And alienating parents are masters at splitting, at taking one position on the one side of the dilemma. And as a targeted parent, you say, well, I have to discipline my kids. I can't let them run wild in my house. So you discipline the child, and then you're criticized as being too punitive, too oppressive. And if you don't discipline your child because you're afraid of that, then you're laissez-faire and the kids run wild. You can never find your
Hmm.
sweet spot. And as forensic evaluators, that can also be the case where we always find out that we're doing too much or too little, we're too
Hmm.
expensive, or we're not doing a thorough enough job. Or so
Hmm.
again, the trickle down effect of what targeted parents experience in alienation comes down to professionals often experiencing no safe place when providing service because
Hmm.
they're criticized from on both ends.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Where do you stand on this now? How are we trying to navigate this currently? Try to set up the best product and best process for our clients.
Yeah, good. That's a good question. I think what we've tried to do in anticipation of trying to meet the needs of attorneys and clients is that we, on the front end, will provide a menu, if you will, of how they can select a certain type of evaluation. And there's brief assessment guidelines that we can follow versus a more comprehensive custody and parenting time evaluation. And so we have them on the front end, select which one they want. They want a real streamlined evaluation that's going to be less costly, but then they accept the other side, which is we're not going to be doing perhaps a more limited cursory review of the collateral information, and we're not going to be doing multiple collateral interviews with every teacher that's been involved, their caregiver. And so we're
Hmm.
limiting the scope on the front end to make it more streamlined, and then they choose that to save money and save time, but yet get a good product, but maybe not as comprehensive as a real thorough one, which is on the other side that they can select. And then we also have something in the middle.
Hmm.
So we try to make those arrangements on the front end so clients know what they're getting into, what they're paying for, and what to expect.
Mm. I think it's important to point out that there are some parallels between parenting time agreements and holding an alienating parent accountable is because if that's proactively agreed upon and there's something in writing and they've agreed to something, then it becomes a whole lot easier to hold them accountable to what they agreed to. And so if it's hey, just start the evaluation, let us know what you need, let us know how it goes, and we'll figure it out on the back end that can be manipulated, like you mentioned, trying to find that sweet spot. Either we did too much, I'm not paying this, this is way too expensive, how dare you, bill me for this, or how could you not talk to this person? How could you not interview this
Right,
person? And if you get a sense of the scope on the front end, then everyone can't really come back with
right,
hindsight and say that this is not what I agreed to. So if
right,
as a targeted parent, if you're trying to get an evaluation done, that can be one way to try to make sure it sticks. Is to
right,
try to advocate for that. And again, that depends on your situation. If you want to go for the full bore and go all the way for all the details, or if you want to try to limit the scope and just making sure everyone's on the same
right.
page. So yeah.
And I think you make a good point. The dilemmas, again, that the targeted parents get into because we often will want targeted parents to get more prescriptive of how the exchanges are going to go and how they're going to
Mm-hmm.
split the costs of extracurriculars and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they try to get some specificity around that, and then sometimes they get accused of, oh, you're trying to be controlling and you're trying to get everything written down. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, because we want to have an agreement and hold people
Mm-hmm.
accountable. So
Yeah.
again, that dilemma that we
Yeah.
experience as professionals, the targeted parents can appreciate.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Anything else you want to say about evaluations? I think we pretty much covered it.
Yeah, I
That
think that we'll
concludes.
probably, say more as we go, but
Yeah,
yeah, we
we'll
can
get some fit.
transition to some other
Yeah.
domains.
So the next one I want to talk about is the current environment around hypervigilance around a professional's role, and maybe we can try to describe what that means. And so I think that one thing that forensic psychology has introduced to the field is trying to have a definable role for each professional that's touching a case. And so as evaluators, as we talked about earlier, we're going to just be evaluating that client. We're not really going to be doing extemporaneously, at least like any treatment as we're evaluating or trying to make any interventions. We have to get all the information, then write the report. And so we have to stay really vigilant in that. And on the other
Right.
side, if you're on the treatment side as a professional, like you have to be super vigilant with that. And so I wonder if we can just talk about the implications of the emphasis that the guidelines have put on that and how that can affect people
Right.
in these cases.
Yeah, and again, going back to the Wild Wild West days back in the 90s, it's actually when I was
Mhm.
kind of bored just around that time.
Yeah.
It wasn't that wild.
Hey, I was
Um,
alive in the 80s, all right?
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, well-intentioned
Hmm.
clinicians would be tapped by attorneys and family court judges to provide help for families, and so you to provide an evaluation and be these again before the guidelines, and then the family ends up having issues with needing a counselor or might needing some co-parenting counseling or parent coordination. And hey, this professional who did this evaluation was very helpful and seemed insightful. Let's ask him or her to
Hmm.
do some counseling. And so
Or vice versa, right?
or vice,
Yeah.
yeah, more often that one
Yeah.
way. I mean, some people
Yeah.
had this idea that a counselor being an evaluator could be a problem.
Hmm.
But it would happen again before
Hmm.
these guidelines came
Hmm.
along. A child
Not all the
counselor,
time, but yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there wasn't these ethical guidelines that provided, proper rules and ethics around staying in your lane and what role are you
Hmm.
playing. And so that is good that we
Hmm.
have those so that people aren't playing multiple roles in a case. But they can also create complications with collaboration and complications with being a reunification counselor sometimes and being asked to provide an evaluative opinion about what the dynamics are in the
Hmm.
case and why the children are not wanting to spend time with mom or dad.
Hmm. So the dilemma being mostly on the treatment side for this, because as an evaluator, it's definitely a little easier just to stay in your role because you have a court order, and they come in for the evaluation. It's pretty structured, and so you just
Right.
follow the process. But sometimes families will come in and just get some treatment, just say like, "Hey, we need some family therapy," and then all of a sudden, a clinician will be put in that room where they have a sense of what's going on, and then they might get asked to opine about what's going on, and then think. So, how does that usually play out, Randy? And how do clients get stuck in the middle of that? Or sorry, clinicians and clients.
Right. I think, yeah, again, I think that, again, evaluations, because of what we just discussed, can be really expensive and take a lot of time to find the evaluator, do the evaluation, and you've got children, like say, who are resisting or refusing court-ordered parenting time, and well-intentioned family court judges and attorneys say, well, let's just do some reunification counseling,
Mm-hmm.
because we need to get this moving forward and figure out what's going on with the kids. And then a reunification counselor, again, reunification counseling has not been on board that long. There was no
Mm-hmm.
such thing as reunification counseling when I first started. That's been more of a specialty area in the last, 10 years or so. And so a well-intentioned reunification counselor, my being one of them years ago, would say, sure, let's get some reunification going. And then we end up not having a sense of why the kids are resisting or refusing parenting time. Start the counseling, and then all of a sudden, the kids don't want to go to counseling and be in the same room with a targeted parent. And as a clinician, you're like, I think there's some alienation going on, and you have a clinical intuition that that's
Mm-hmm.
what's happening, and then you start talking to the targeted parent about that and why the children, and helping the targeted parent understand it, not get mad at the child. And then all of a sudden, an attorney gets involved and says, "Can you provide some testimony or some a report
Write a
to get
letter.
write a
Yeah.
letter, an update on how the
Mm-hmm.
reunification counseling's going and why you think it's not progressing?" So then, as a well-intentioned reunification counselor, you provide an evaluative opinion about what the resist or refuse dynamics are, what the causation is, and
Mm-hmm.
then you say it's an alienation dynamic or it's an estrangement dynamic. Either way, the attorney on the other side doesn't want you to go against their client. So then you go to testify, and they'll say, "Well, Mr. Flood, you're hired to be a reunification counselor, correct?" "Yes." Is counseling in the ethical guidelines give you the ability to make evaluative assessments about why the children are resisting or refusing? Or is that more of a role of an evaluator? What do I have to answer to that? It's more of a
It's an
role of
evaluator. Yeah. Right.
it's more of an evaluator. So then I'm outside the purview of a counselor providing evaluative assessments about something that's going on in the family dynamics, and then that whole reunification process gets hamstrung. And
Mm-hmm.
then a judge is like, well, then now what do we do? Oh, well, let's get
Gotta
an
find somebody
evaluation.
else.
Or
Or find somebody else, and then it gets delayed, and then yep, and then it
yep,
just gets pushed down the road, and so
right.
yep, yep. So I think it's the reason we're bringing this up again to try to, as we go through each one of these, talk about why is this important for the targeted parent to know. And it's important here because of what Randy's just saying is you got to know that going into a reunification situation. If you start seeing like, yep, this is really obvious. Can't you see what's going on here? Look what's happening in the room. And you want to say like, can you just tell someone about this, please? Can you just let the judge know? And you got that burning fire inside of you to try to get people to see your situation and try to get empathy for you. But if you start going barking up the wrong tree and say, "Hey, reunification therapist, can you go do this?" and then the reunification therapist is going to be put in this conundrum because maybe they do have a good sense of like, yeah, this is going on, but the dilemma is like, yep, this seems pretty obvious to me. It would be I could try to opine about this, but that's not my role. And so do I try to write this letter because I have a good clinical intuition that this might be going on because there's some telltale signs, or do I just stay back and try to be a treatment provider because that's what the guidelines say? And most of the time, the good reunification therapist is going to stick to the guidelines and be like, "Hey, I can't write that letter," you know. But then again,
Mhm.
if they do fall outside and go in and smudge that gray area and try to testify, then you're actually going to be worse off as a targeted parent if the alienating parent has a good attorney because they're
Right.
going to take advantage of that, and then you're going to be further back, one step forward, two steps back, and you're going to be further away from because then they can delay and they say, well, that was a unprofessional conduct by this person, so now we got to find it. Then we're going to take an extra couple months to find the right therapist because we didn't look hard enough the first time, and then you're 6 months down the road and you've done nothing. So just
Right.
so that's why it's really
Right.
important to say, have a good understanding of what's going on before, if it's possible, to have a really good understanding of what's going on before going into reunification therapy and
Right.
understand why you're there. So,
And I would go on to say that as a reunification therapist, we'll talk about, I think, that spectrum of estrangement where there's abuse and neglect going on. Again, an alienating
mm-hmm,
parent is alleging the reason the children don't want to go to see this average range or superior parent, as say as an assessment deems,
mm-hmm,
is because there's unfitness, and so that's why they're rejecting. And so
mm-hmm,
if you're setting up reunification for an estrangement case where the parent is unfit and the child's fear and resistance is based on experience and based in reality, the treatment paradigm
mm-hmm,
for estrangement is very different than the treatment paradigm for alienated children. With
mm-hmm,
estranged children, you are pacing with them and you giving that child a lot of self-agency because they've been traumatized. So the child's
mm-hmm,
voice is based in some kind of real experience. In contrast, an alien child is infused with this cancerous false narrative in their brain, and there's what they're speaking has been so contaminated by the alienating parent and the attachment process that what they're saying they want or don't want is contaminated. It's not based in reality. So as a treatment provider, you're having to push that child into doing something sometimes they don't want to do. And then you
mm-hmm,
can be accused of not being sensitive to the child's needs if the
mm-hmm.
other attorney's not liking it. So again, it puts you in a really complicated predicament.
So it's not always possible. There are every situation is different. The courts might be more amenable to
Yep.
evaluations than other courts. It all depends,
Yep.
but that's why
Yep.
getting some sort of evaluative or judicial finding in your hand before you go to reunification and understand what type of treatment are we doing here, because really it is two different things. And just saying
Right.
reunification as a blanket term can be a little misleading. And if you go in and try to figure it out and you've got these competing narratives, that clinician in the middle is like, what am I supposed to do here? And so that
Right.
clarity can really help ahead of time. So if you're trying to figure out where to put your resources and you only have so many resources, trying to figure out the order of those things can just be important as you try to
Right.
figure this out. So, yep.
Can I add, Zach, that I think again, just like you were saying that we want things in writing on the front end, like say
Mm,
there are limited resources and a family can't afford a big evaluation and then following it up with reunification counseling would be to
mm-hmm,
put in writing in the court order, perhaps, depending on the district you live in and the attorneys you're working with, to be
mm,
able to say we're going to empower the reunification therapist if there's problems in the reunification to make some decisions and
mm,
provide the judge in a case conference, for example, their clinical impressions as to what's going on, what are the causes of it, and we're going to take that person's professional opinion, use it to help guide the reunification. If you can get
mm,
buy-in on the front
mm,
end, maybe you could save money and time by having one professional. But again, if that's not covered on the front end, landmines
yeah.
are going to be all over the place.
That's right. That's right. And so again, why are we doing this? Giving you this information to be able to empathize with a clinician to know what they need to best help you and your family. Because this is ultimately about how it helps the targeted parent, how you guys can navigate that. So we want to make sure that you understand what's going on there because the clinician's gonna follow what they know and follow what's best for the family. That's gonna be ultimately their goal. So I think let's skip around here, Randy, real quick and go down a little further and just talk about uh, some of the conflicts and some of the just as we're trying to navigate those dynamics about why the push and pull between estrangement and alienation can be tricky for clinicians as they're trying to treat and some of the stuff that's going on in the media and going on in the zeitgeist about these different groups. And so talking a little bit about some of the alienation people and then some of the domestic violence advocates out there and how those can kind of get mixed up in this and trying to stay between those two truths and how those can unfold. I think it's important to
Yeah,
talk about. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, being again, the luxury of being in the field for a while is giving me some perspective of history. Um, and I think, unfortunately, we have two zealous grassroots movements, sometimes that are not intersecting, and they see that they're on a collision course rather than seeing that they can be at the intersections of family dynamics,
Hmm.
and then we just have to make a decision about whether we turn left or right, rather than we're coming in and hitting a wall. Um, and so domestic violence and child abuse advocates, for all the right reasons, having worked in the field of domestic violence and co-authored a book on it, is that they're fearful that people who are domestic violence offenders are going to use the defense of parental alienation to obfuscate their abusive and controlling behavior. So they're essentially saying that the children rejecting me and being scared of me, it has nothing to do with me beating up their co-parent, their mom or their dad, and the children witnessing it. Nothing to do with me being controlling and abusive and trying to
Hmm.
oppress and terrorize my co-parent post-divorce. It has to do with this alienation dynamic, and so the children are rejecting me because of that. Well, if you work in the field of domestic violence, you're going to be seething with anger at the professionals, judges, and anybody who takes a alienation defense and goes with it when it actually isn't a case of alienation. And so you have a lot of zealous people working with good intentions to try to debunk parental alienation and say it's junk science, that it doesn't exist, don't believe it, don't allow it into court, do a Daubert hearing, do whatever you can, because parental alienation is being used to be abusive. Is that true? Yes. Is that always true? No. Because I also work on the other side and see parental alienation, targeted parents who have alienating parents who are making false or exaggerated allegations of domestic violence and child abuse and neglect. I've had cases where protective services have been involved multiple times, up to 20 times, with false allegations of abuse and neglect, and it's an alienation case. And so you have concerned professionals on both sides trying to do really good work. And I think now, in the current um, ideas and umbrellas and decision making trees in our profession, we finally have this larger umbrella of resist and refuse dynamics and parent child contact problems. And under that umbrella exists estrangement. And under that umbrella exists alienation. And there's a whole spectrum in between. And so alienation is a form of family violence, is a form of family abuse. Battering behavior is a form of family violence and abuse. All of it needs to be addressed appropriately, but you have to have multiple hypotheses when you approach these cases and provide the kinds of treatment and parenting time recommendations based on what's going on in the family, not based on your
Hmm.
theories and your biases and your pet, um,
Right.
projects.
Yeah. I think another thing, just not to add any extra complication, but do it anyway, is like thinking about hybrid cases. The way that
Yeah.
we conceptualize them is like, just to give you an example, is like there's one parent that might have an alcohol abuse problem, and that's gotten in the way of their parenting. It's impaired their ability to be present, their judgment. They might have overlooked some things, and they had some actual issues. But then they went and got clean, and they've been sober for 2 years and done a lot of therapy and done a lot of things. But the things that they did were really awful, and they had some issues. But they've done a bunch of rehabilitation, and then all of a sudden, there is a history of some estrangement, but at the same time, it's 2 years later, and they still haven't had one conversation with their kids because they're getting punished for this stuff, and they've done all this work, and they're not being able to re-engage with their kids. And so then a clinician's got both things going on at once. Is like, yep, you had some issues as a parent that you need to work on, but also you're being alienated from your kids right now, and so it's a little bit of a situation where then you have to be able to empathize with a clinician or professionals or courts or other people involved if that might be more true to your case. It's like, yep, I had some issues. I owned up to them. I'm accountable for them, but also I'd love to be in my, because there's a lot of people that have drinking problems that also have access to their kids. You know, it's not like a death sentence to your parenting
Right,
status. So it's tricky, and that just leaving room for that stuff to work itself out and to be put on the table and discussed can be really helpful.
right,
But yeah,
right.
because then you got all that room in the middle.
Yep. Yeah, you see these hybrid cases and they're just super complicated to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially when you see a case kind of having a lifespan,
Mm-hmm.
it starts out, like you said, Zach, with an estrangement dynamic, and then you're now 2, 3, 4 years. I've had cases where estrangement dynamic started and now we're 4 years into it, and you have a
Mm-hmm.
parent who's been gone through all the rehabilitation recommended to them, and they're 3, 4 years later, still have no access to their
Mm-hmm.
children. And it's understandable why a protective parent has concerns and doesn't want to trust again, and maybe just wants to erase that bad parent from the children's life and
Mm-hmm.
let the new stepmom or stepdad step in and take over
Mm-hmm.
and not have to deal with the complications of are they really rehabilitated or not. And
Mm-hmm.
so then that alienation dynamic, or what we call counterproductive protective parenting, it might not be
Right.
alienation, but their
Right.
protection is
Right.
now counterproductive because the data
Yeah.
suggests it's time to start moving forward and they resist because they're
Mm-hmm.
scared and becoming protective. And then there's
Mm-hmm.
others, parents who is truly just vindictive and
Mm-hmm.
resentful. They've been wounded and hurt from the past, and they're just not wanting to move forward, and again can be understandable from an empathic lens. But when it comes to the children, this is not
Yeah.
about parents
Yeah.
all the time, it's children, their
Yeah.
access to a rehabilitated parent.
Right, right. And so again, as clinicians, we have to hold a lot of that in our heads and try to figure out what's the best way to go forward. And
Right,
if we if we want to get super dogmatic and plant our flag on something because we really believe in it, or do we try to oscillate and try to leave space for this stuff to work out? You know, we want to go and do what's best for the kids. That ultimately becomes our lighthouse in the storm. We really try to gotta strive for that. But in the process
right.
of figuring that out, there can be a lot of complicating factors that go into that. And so, clinicians. So, in order, speaking of lighthouses in the storms, I think we should talk about how clinicians can navigate these and some of the dilemmas that can come up as we try to navigate the industry as a whole. And so, one thing that we want to talk about is collaboration with other professionals in our community and working together to try to help families, or being in a silo and trying to just stay isolated and try to be as objective as possible. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how that plays out and how that can be exploited sometimes by attorneys and highlighted. So.
Right. And again, I think targeted parents can identify with this. Again, they get into this dilemma. It's like, you want to talk to the teachers and you want to talk to, the coaches and try to let them know what's going on in the family and stuff. And then the alienating parent will say, look at they're setting the table. They're trying to control the teachers and the coaches and let them know that they're the
Mhm.
good parent. And if they isolate and don't say anything or build relationships with them, then they're look like they're aloof, or they're not
Shut
concerned
up.
about the children. They don't
Mhm.
collaborate or ever contact the teachers. So
Hey,
this
look, he doesn't even
dilemma,
he doesn't even they don't even care. She doesn't even
right,
care. He doesn't even care. Right.
right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we run into the same kind of dilemma where in this modern era where we we have different lanes we're supposed to be practicing in and not talking to other professionals who we might contaminate, that might take the case in the community, who is going to play a different role. To protect ourselves from doing that, we work in a silo, and don't get consultation or collaboration, and then we're at risk of not having our biases illuminated.
Hmm.
And because as humans, we all have biases, and the only way to correct for them is through consultation and collaboration.
Yeah.
So then if you start consulting and collaborating with local professionals who are doing who are also doing forensic family counseling and evaluations and such, then if during litigation, if you have access to those, you do consultation with them, then all of a sudden attorneys can make the argument that that whole web of professionals should be eliminated because you're involved with them.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
it's like you collaborate and you're contaminating other professionals to work on the case, and you stay in your silo, and then you got all these biases and you're working, all alone,
Mhm.
and you're so it again it becomes this complicated dilemma.
Yeah, and so it's about, and that necessarily is more on the clinician side than it is the targeted parent side, but it's still
Yeah,
important to know, like, if this is going to come up in some, not all, but in some litigation for these cases afterwards. And it is the right thing to do is to get supervision and collaboration, because that, like you said, that checks the biases that is outlined in the guidelines. If this is
right.
good, it's also outlined in the overall APA guidelines of, like, you got to be able to have consultation and supervision to work through these complicated cases. But it is something where a clinician might feel pressure sometimes to stay siloed and to stay because it's just easier. It makes it
Yeah.
easier to not have to deal with all that stuff. And that's sort of what targeted parents might feel as well. It's just easier to not fight about that. Like, let's just let that be over there and just try to live my life, versus, no, I'm going to lean into this because it's the right thing to do, because it's part of what makes a better clinician, a better parent, is to try to lean into these parts of being a parent or part of a clinician that help the kids. And so it's something that can come to light for
Yeah.
sure. So, um, and so what are some of the ramifications of this? Like, what do we see in the industry, and why is it important for us to talk about these things as they pile up in all of these dilemmas?
Right.
Like, what goes down?
Well, I think that one of the things that, we've learned in this field, and I think the medical field has done a pretty good job with complicated medical cases. And you look at the Cleveland clinics and Mayo clinics and things like that, where they've had
Mm,
multiple doctors and are looking at a patient and no one's communicating with each other, and it's kind of everything's bifurcated and segmented, and and they're
mm,
being passed around with doctors, and no one can come up with a diagnosis and figure out a treatment plan for this patient. So then they go out to
mm,
Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic, and they have all these clinicians, the heart specialists, kidney specialists, all these people working on different parts of the body, and then they all come together and they argue about what is going
mhm,
on with the patient, and then come up and they have competing arguments, and have these contentious kind of team meetings, and then they come up with a diagnosis and a plan that then the patient is sent back to their region to work on. When we try to do that in family court, which we know that in alienation, it's triangulation, um, splitting, all of that is
mm.
what makes alienation grow and be effective. And so they don't want professionals to collaborate. Alienators want, these silos and stuff like that, and setting the table and
Play against each other, and yeah.
playing against each other. So then when you try to get a team together to work more collaboratively, then sometimes it can be seen as, well, you're all colluding with each other and you're in this big,
Mm,
group think, and you need people in different parts of the city and who are not talking to each other to have their separate opinions to keep it straight and up, on the up and up, rather than seeing this is a complicated family, and can we bring a team of professionals again who all are working for the best interest of the children, and
mhm,
have these competing arguments as a parenting coordinator, as a child therapist, as an evaluator, as whatever it is that's working with the family, to collaborate and try to help the judge and work together as a team with case conferencing. That
mhm,
is a model I think has worked. The
mhm.
Fountain Hill Center has a collaborative team, but again, it gets seen in this dilemma of true profound truths. Yeah, there are cases where you get collusion and groupthink, and no one's challenging each other, and that's a concern. But working in a bifurcated way and not collaborating and not talking is also doesn't work. There's got to
Yeah.
be a way to make it
You have
work.
to do it the right way with intention. You can't just do it
Yeah.
haphazardly and as you
Right.
go. It has to be well thought out, and it has to be something that's formal. And that's
Yeah.
what we try to establish. It's not just something that we do in our free time. It's something that we do with intention, and that's
Yeah.
that's how it can really work. But I think it's important to say is, like, as an industry as a whole, what are some of the pressures that therapists have to face when they're in these alienation cases. You talk about the triangulation and pitting people against each other and straying from the roles is there are instances where therapists at a much higher rate than normal just general psychotherapy are subjected to investigations and complaints with licensing authorities, and that's just a
Right,
reality of this, and it's something that a therapist will have to face is, do I stay in this work and do what I can to help these families, or do I just stop taking this work? And do I just kind of go do something else that's
right,
not as risky or not as
right.
high stakes in that regard? And so I just know I think we should just talk
Yeah,
a little bit about the parallels between what therapists might be experiencing and what targeted might be experiencing as well.
yeah. Yeah, and again, I think targeted parents totally say, "Hey, I know exactly what you're talking about because
Mhm,
I had multiple investigations and police called to my house and you get to a point as a targeted parent, you're fighting and fighting and trying to do what's best for your kids, and then you've got your life and you've got your new stepchildren or stepfamily or whatever that you're trying to protect. And then you've got multiple investigations and police coming to your house or whatever. And then you're like, at what point do you say, I can't do this anymore? There's just too much
mhm,
chaos, too much stress. And unfortunately, that's what happens with professionals is that, I've had dear colleagues of mine over the years who doing, I've recruited and say, hey, come and do family forensic counseling and evaluations because we really need all the help. And this is really satisfying work to help kids. And they come in, with good intentions. And then after about 5 years, they're like, peace out, man. I've had two Lara
mhm,
investigations, just trying to do the right thing. And, and these alienating parents will file
mhm,
civil suits, malpractice, they'll call media,
mhm,
and then all of a sudden there's a witch hunt where you're being interviewed or
mhm,
being castigated. And some people want to go home and, kick up their feet and watch a Netflix series and help their kids with homework. And they're just like, my life is better without doing this work. It's just too stressful.
mhm,
And again, do we need investigations for unruly professionals? I mean, we know in alienation and targeted parents know this, that there's a lot
mhm,
of professionals that do unethical work
mhm,
and oftentimes aren't held accountable. They write letters they shouldn't be writing to the judges. They're providing trauma and abuse treatment when the children haven't been traumatized or abused except through alienation.
mhm,
And so there needs to be investigations by these licensing bureaus to hold counselors accountable for missteps.
mhm,
But like dilemmas, two profound truths. The other side of it,
mhm,
there's a lot of really good therapists doing good work in the community, and they're being harassed and demonized, and they get burned out.
mhm. Yeah, so it's really important to just just to know that as you go into this is when you're working with therapists, if you start pushing really hard and you start because you've got a fire in your belly and you've been frustrated, you've hit a lot of walls in your time trying to figure this out, and you finally get to a place that's not going exactly how you want it to go, and you have this vision, and you plow through that and start really acting aggressively with the therapist that might be trying to do the best they can. It's just important to know this stuff as you're going through and to be able to empathize and be able to know that this is the field that you're navigating, because the ultimate goal here is to get everyone on the same page, and that does come with collaboration and all that.
Yeah,
And so yeah, it's just important to know, and this is just an acknowledgement of the challenging nature of this stuff, but it also highlights how important it is, and it's also specialized, and not everyone can do this work.
right,
It's not going to be in everyone's cup of tea, if you want
right.
to put it that way. And so it's
Well,
important to, yeah, go.
Well, why do you do it, Zach? I mean, you can ask me the question. I mean, it's like,
Yep.
yeah, this is incredibly stressful.
Hmm.
If there's anything if there's sleepless nights, it's not
Hmm.
in the psychotherapy groups or
Hmm.
the therapy clients. It's the evaluations, it's the
Yeah.
parenting coordination, it's the reunification
Yeah.
cases. But why do you do
Yeah.
it? Why do you stay in?
The kids is the simple answer. The kids, because it's
Mhm.
someone's got to help these kids, and it's becomes more. It's a mission in a way, a mission for the truth. It's a mission because it's the
Mhm.
right thing to do, and it can. it can really be challenging, but usually things that are challenging for reasons
Right,
because they're worth it and there's stakes involved.
right,
And there's all different types of work. I'm not saying I fill my entire caseload with these cases, but it's a really important part of what we do, and I try to stay centered in that, and that's just
right,
and it takes collaboration. It takes working with other people and being able to have support and being able to have a network of people that can work with you to help navigate these cases in a way that's healthy and accountable, and that helps buttress the stress and some of the ramifications of doing this work. And so if you
right.
do it the right way and with intention, it can be for
Right.
wonderful, wonderful reasons. How about
Yeah.
you? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's similar. It's the children and kind of like they don't, sometimes they get guardian ad litems and can be the
Hmm.
voice of the children, but it's
Hmm.
being able to help the children and to also help parents be the best versions of themselves because divorce
Hmm.
and separation can be just incredibly stressful, especially if you're involved in an estrangement, unfit parent, or you're involved in alienation. It's these parents need truth and justice and need someone to see through all the noise and the
Hmm.
cacophony of false narratives. And so I find it rewarding and satisfying to be able to be a voice of the children and a voice of justice. And I always, when I do get sad about myself about the stress. I remember, Martin Luther King was, jailed and killed for doing the right thing, and Jesus was crucified, and Nelson Mandela sat in prison for a long time before he was finally vindicated, and so not to say that that's the cross I got to carry, but to say that stress comes along with the job,
Hmm.
and we need good psychologists, social workers who have the stamina and the resolve to stay in it. And so I've
Hmm.
just committed to stay in it and to try to
Hmm.
continue to try to be helpful.
Yeah, we advocate for alienated parents, and we do a lot of this work, and we also do domestic violence work for abuse
Right.
and neglectful parents, and we want there to be a comprehensive culture around this whole process to be able to hold these two truths and to have nuanced conversations. And it's just really hard to do. It's much easier to just
Right.
swing to one side and just have a one size fits
Right.
all type of thing. It's easier for
Right.
our brains to organize. Humans are wired to go away from uncertainty and towards certainty. It's what keeps
Right.
us safe in the
Yeah.
wild. So it takes a lot of
Right.
mental acuity, mental effort to try to hold these things at once. And so
Right.
as targeted parents, you want to try to be able to go hand in hand with professionals in that pursuit and be able to have an open mind and understand that there are human beings on the other side of these things. We're not robots. And so being able to have this knowledge can really help you approach these places
Right.
with a radical amount of humanness.
Right.
And that really helps
Yeah.
everyone see eye to eye. So
Yeah. And I would say that again, this parallels what targeted parents go through. And I know that I've sat
mm,
with targeted parents who just in anguish are like,
mm,
do I stay in this? Is it
mm-hmm,
is it really worth it for the kids? Is it worth it for me and my life? And I always err on the side of encouraging them to hang in there because it does get
mm-hmm,
stressful and then you're going through a stressful moment and something gets resolved and you get new life and kind of energy and then they're like, boy, I'm glad you encouraged me to hang in there because now we got the judge seems to be on board with what's going on. We're getting some traction. We're getting, and so I really work to try to get targeted parents to hang in there. And I do with my colleagues too, when they get in a tough case
mm-hmm,
and I want them to try to hang in there because we need people helping. But at the
mm-hmm,
same time, I respect people who want to take
mm-hmm,
care of themselves. And it's really a hard decision when you say
mm-hmm,
I have to leave, leave the
mm-hmm.
profession and not do this work anymore, or I can't continue to fight for my kids anymore. I don't have any more money. I don't have any more energy. I'm really
Yeah.
depressed. So we encourage, but yet we try to understand when people have to make tough choices.
Mhm. And so we hope that that's the takeaway from this, that you can stick with it and try to hold these things. It's not going to be an easy path, and that's why it's important to highlight these things. So, lastly, I just wanted to say thank you to Family Access, Families Divided TV, and Elaine for having us. And it's been a joy to talk about this, and also we're here for alienated parents as well as a resource. You can reach out to us. And we are here to provide support and provide services to try to help you navigate this as well. So we hope you do that if you feel the need to. So again, thank you, Elaine, and thank you everybody, and we wish you nothing but the best.